If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. This small study will forever change the way you read Genesis chapter 1. By the end of this, I believe you'll understand Genesis chapter 1 on a deeper level, and you'll know what specific key words and key ideas to look for in this specific chapter. This is what brings depth to Bible study. Let's jump into the Word of God. Just a few things to note up front before we dig into the text and walk through the passage. Number one, the summary of this story is that God creates the whole world in 7 days. Day number 1, God creates the light, brings light into the darkness. Day number 2, God separates the waters below from the waters above, and the expanse he creates is the sky. Day number 3, or referred to as the heavens. Day number 3, God brings land up from the waters and vegetation up from the land. Day number 4, God brings the sun, the moon, the stars into existence to govern the day and the night. Day number 5, God actually fills the waters and the sky with birds and with water creatures. And day number 6, God makes animals on the land and humanity in his image. Okay, so day number 7, we know that God rests, Shabbat, the Sabbath. It's very important, but that's not the focus of this study. What I want you to note are some main ideas that repeat throughout this passage, and I've highlighted them for your convenience. For instance, in day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you are always going to see that God says something, God sees, God calls something what it is, and God separates something. So every single day, God calls, God sees, God separates, and several days, you'll see that God actually makes or creates. And every day, except day number 2, we see God say that this is good. He saw that it was good. Let me show you what I mean. This being technically the first day. Look at what it says. And God said, "Let there be light." So God says, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, right? So God says, God sees, and God separated the light from the darkness. Okay, so God says, God saw, God separated, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So what I want you to pay attention to when you read Genesis chapter 1 in particular, with each specific day, notice when God says something, notice what he says, notice what he's calling things in relation to other things that he's calling by their name. Notice what God separates and the purpose for which he separates. And then you'll also see instances, for example, right here in verse 1, where God creates. And I believe this is going to be a summary statement of the text, not for this study though, okay? And so what I want you to pay attention to, we're going to skim through the text. We're not going to take too long because I'm going to break this down into separate videos where we'll dive into different topics a little more. But day number 1, again, God sees, God saw, or God says, God saw, God calls the light day, God separates, right? All those different things are happening. And then we go to day 2, and I want you to see what happens. You're going to see that God says something, then he calls something by its name that he gives it, and then he separates something. God says, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters," and God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were actually above the expanse. And what does God do? Well, it was so, and God called the expanse, heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. So day number 2, that same flow, that same structure. It's very important to see. And a couple observations to make up front about this whole narrative in Genesis chapter 1. Number 1, you're going to see that the typical understanding of God creating isn't necessarily what's happening here. Here's what I mean. God creating in Genesis chapter 1 is mainly, not only, but mainly, God is ordering, God is structuring, God is separating what he's already brought into existence prior to the opening of Genesis chapter 1. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, the creation story actually opens with a formless, void world that has deep darkness and deep waters over it. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. The earth is described as being without form, without God shaping and molding it, and it's void. And darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. I believe the deep there is actually in reference to the waters, something we'll see throughout the Old Testament. So the narrative actually opens with the condition of the world before God interacts with it is formless, void, darkness is over it, and it's just chaotic water. And you go, chaotic water, you just infused your own understanding. As we travel through this text a little more in the next few videos, you'll see what I mean. And then another observation to make before we jump to day 3 is that each creation day actually starts with the evening, right here, and ends with the morning. Which means what? It's starting in darkness and ending with the light. And that's literally how the first day opens. Darkness is present. God says, let there be light. And so the first thing God creates on day number 1 is the light that penetrates and is separated from the darkness. Day number 2, however, here's an observation to make about day 2. This is the only day you're going to see, besides the Sabbath, if I remember correctly, day number 7. There's no explicit statement. Yeah, God blesses that day, makes it so that's different. Day number 2, forget that. Day number 2 is the only day where you do not see the statement, God saw that it was good. Day number 2 is the only time you don't see that statement. You see it on day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. Just an observation to make. Okay, so jumping into day number 3. So God has brought light into the darkness. God has separated the waters so that there's an expanse. Now day 3, God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. Okay, and let the dry land appear. And usually we think of that as God poofing land into existence. Actually, he says the dry land is coming up from the waters. And it was so, God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So the waters under the heavens are gathered into one place, and the dry land seems to come up from that. Okay, so an observation to make about day number 3 is this. God actually brings the land up from, the appearance of the land is related to the waters being gathered into one place. So you'll see the continuance of day 3 is that vegetation comes up from the earth, the land, just as the land itself seems to come up from the waters. So usually we think of the land as being poofed into existence based on us just reading into this word appearing. But it's as if the waters bringing forth the land is juxtaposed to, not in contrast to, but similar to the land bringing forth vegetation. I believe that's a similar idea because it happens on the same day. God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. So the earth is producing, which seems to be, again, likened to the waters bringing forth the land by the word of the Lord. Plants yielding seed. This is important to know. The fact that the plants are described as yielding seed, which means it's self-producing by the word of the Lord. And that fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed. Again, I just pay attention to repeating ideas when things are described in certain ways that seem to repeat. Pay attention to that. Each according to its kind on the earth. So the waters are gathered into one place. The dry land seems to come up from that, or the seas reveal the land underneath it. And then from the land, God brings forth vegetation. The earth brought forth vegetation. There's that language again of bringing forth. And I think that's super important to understand as it relates to how God creates, as it relates to the rest of the story of the Bible, as it relates to a lot that God does and calls us to do. There's a pattern in the scriptures of things that are brought forth by the word of the Lord. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed. Again, the focus is on its ability to reproduce according to their own kinds, and tree bearing fruit in which is their seed. Again, each according to its kind, which again is to note, if something repeats like that over and over, it yields seed, it produces seed, in it is seed, it's telling you that there's something important you need to pay attention to or hang on to until clarity comes later in the text. And God saw that it was good. So once again, there was evening and there was morning, the third day. So what do we see in day 3? God says, right? I'll back it up for you. God says, God here is separating, not explicitly. We don't see the explicit statement, and God separated, but the waters gathering and the land appearing out of that, and the waters being gathered together from the land is a separating that is taking place, though it's not explicitly stated as such. So God speaks, God calls something what it is, God separates, and then we have at the end of this day, day number 3, God saw that it was good. Now, we didn't see that in day 2 for some reason. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse. We have day 4 now starting. Let there be lights in the expanse. of the heavens to separate the day from the night. So we see more separating taking place. Except what God does is he appoints sun and moon to be a part of that separation and that dividing line between day and night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, not just talking about how to measure time and know where we're at in history, but referring to the Jewish feasts and festivals and holidays, mainly, I believe is what's in mind. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights. This is one of the days where we see God create, God making something. He made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. Okay? And then you have the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. Remember how I said God creating is setting things in place, setting boundaries, separating things, organizing the world as it should be, structuring. God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. Once again, there's this emphasis on separation between light and darkness that the sun and the moon play a role in. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, there was morning, the fourth day. Boom, day 4 is done. So once again, we see God sees, or rather God says, God made something right here. God set, God separates, and then God saw that it is indeed good. Now we have day 5. An observation about day 4 is the sun and the moon are actually ruling and governing over the day and the night. Obviously the sun over the day, the moon over the night. Day and night, light and darkness are already separated, but part of the separation process involves the sun and the moon ruling over their territory or domain, that being the day or the night. And this is actually the first occurrence in the creation story where we see ruling and governing, apart from God being over all things. This statement of the two great lights to rule, it's right here, to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. So there's that governing, ruling language. And then we have day 5 starting. God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures, every living creature according to their kind. And then God saw that it's good. Once again, God blesses them and says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas. Boom, day 5. So what do we see in day 5 again? God says, God creates, God saw, and God blessed. This is the very first occurrence of the word, not the idea of, but the word blessing, or for God to bless, where God explicitly blesses something within that language. This doesn't mean that he isn't blessing anything until now, but I think it's actually important to note the fact that the text does not use this word until verse 22 relating to the creatures he puts in the sky and the creatures he puts in the waters, okay? Also, note that the blessing here is actually related to, just poked a hole in my Bible, did it again, being fruitful and multiplying and spreading and filling and multiplying once again. So blessing is connected to being fruitful and multiplying, as we'll see in day 6 with humanity. Now we get to day 6. God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, the animals, and God made the beast according to their kinds, just like the vegetation in day 3. And everything that creeps on the ground, God saw that it was good. But God's not done. And I'm skipping a few things because we'll unpack these later. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds, over livestock, over all the animals, essentially, okay? So what we see here in day number 6, there's no explicit statement about God separating, but the idea is implicit within his action, meaning this: God makes the beasts of the earth, and then God makes humanity, and he separates humanity from the rest of his creatures by saying, humanity is made in his, or God says, our image. That's what distinguishes and separates humanity from the rest of the creatures God has made up to this point. So something to note about day number 6 is God makes land creatures. Day 6 God makes land creatures and humanity on the same day. This is the only other occurrence of dominion and ruling besides day 4, and it's humanity in the image of God ruling over the rest of God's creatures. Just like the sun and the moon govern the day and the night, but this is different. This is the domain and the territory of man is on the earth, okay? Day 6 also has the only creature that is made in God's image, and the blessing of humanity, you're going to see in verse 27, is connected to being fruitful and multiplying, right? God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. 3 times we see that idea in 2 verses, okay? Male and female, he created them. So being made in the image of God is to be male, to be female, and God blessed them. What does God bless them with? Well, he says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And then this is different than the blessing he gave to the birds and the sea creatures. Subdue, have dominion over every living thing that moves on the earth. That is unique to humanity, being made in the image of God. We don't see that language used of anything else. The sun and the moon governing the day and the night is similar, but it's not on the earth over the creatures of God, the way humanity is to steward under God's authority the earth that God has given them to rule, okay? So again, day 6, God blesses, God creates, God says, and then you're going to see at the bottom, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. As far as I've come across, this is the only time up to this point where something is decreed by God and declared to be very good. Okay, so day 6, God said, God made, God saw, God blessed, and there is a separation within his activity. So day 1 through 6, we see God saying something, God calling something as it is, God seeing and evaluating it, and God separating. And then at certain times, we see God making, creating, that kind of language. And so the story of creation, and we can go on. There was evening, once again, and there was morning, the 6th day. Then chapter 2 opens with the 7th day where God rests. The story of creation in Genesis chapter 1 actually comes to a close right here in verse 30 and 31. I'll read it for you. And to every beast of the earth and right here, I've given you every plant. He's talking to humanity, yielding seed. Again, the emphasis on its reproduction. It just produces itself over and over. That is on the face of all the earth, every tree with seed in its fruit you shall have for food. And if you're familiar with the language of Genesis 3, you're already tracking with what's happening. These ideas are being planted up front, so you see them unpacked later. It's a foreshadowing of sorts. And to every beast of the earth, every bird of the heavens, all the creatures, everything having the breath of life, I've given every plant for food. So the story of creation in Genesis 1 comes to a close with this interesting instruction and blessing. And what's part of the blessing and instruction is, hey, humanity, I've given you vegetation for food. Within it is seed, the fruit is yours. That's interesting as we enter into Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, okay? So, again, the main repeating ideas and key words in Genesis 1 that you should pay attention to is God saw, God called, God said, God separated, God created, and God made. And that will help you as you read Genesis chapter 1 deeper, hopefully deeper than you ever have before. Hey, I just want to thank you for all your support and prayers that make this ministry possible and help us to accomplish our mission. Your support makes it possible for us to create all the free resources we have available for anyone around the world. Our mission is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach the Bible themselves. So be sure to visit AboveReproachMinistry.com for all these free resources and to support this ministry. And if you're a new believer, be sure to check out the new believer section on the homepage of our website and grab a copy of my book, Fruitful, while you're there. God bless you guys, and as always, keep moving towards Jesus.